We are now going to move on to our keynote speakers, who I'm really excited that are here with us today. If you could advance to the next slide, please. We have two poet laureates. And first we have Aileen Cassinetto, who is the poet laureate from San Mateo County. I'm going to pass it over to her as she will introduce Alexandria and also the activity. So Aileen, are you here and are you ready to take on the activity?
Yes, thank you, Zoe. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I wanted to say how grateful I am to the Office of Sustainability for including poetry in this year's summer retreat. As an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellow, I'm developing a program that aims to equip young people with the language of eco-poetry to help broaden the search for creative solutions to our growing environmental challenges. To that end, I've invited a very special guest to give the keynote address this year. It is my honor and great pleasure to introduce Alexandra Huynh, an 18-year-old Vietnamese American poet from Sacramento. She is a 2020 Sacramento Youth Poet Laureate, a Western Regional Ambassador, and the 2021 National Youth Poet Laureate of the United States. As a second-generation individual, Alexandra employs poetry as a tool of self-reclamation and social justice for marginalized communities. She embodies a radical pride in her Vietnamese heritage and seeks to write her story outside of the context of whiteness. Through poetry, she hopes to give students a vocabulary to articulate their lived experiences and empower them to shape their future. This fall, she will be a freshman at Stanford University, where she aims to combine her passions for creative writing, science, and civic engagement. Youth Climate Ambassadors, please welcome the National Youth Poet Laureate of the United States, Alexandra Nguyen.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Aileen. I will be beginning my keynote with a poem that I wrote called "It Does Not Matter Any Longer Where You Live," from news reports on the fires in California and the floods in Vietnam. 1. They waited for the answers they didn't want to hear but knew were reality. From my living room, I watch as tiny yellow men march into the worst darkness and pretend not to hear when they have names. Witness an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented. The state of California has swallowed Connecticut like fever, leaving behind a scorched footprint the shape of neglect. There are streetlights in the forest now. The forest is a city with wildfire for veins and a steady churn of smog. Vehicles spill onto highways to escape the color of death, but even the lucky ones wake up to smudged sun and sepia. Classic Western. Villainize nature, defend your honor, reduce the brown people to accessory. This is the work of a century's suppression, of a creature that feeds on its own dead. When there is nothing left to breathe, you produce the opposite of oxygen. Don't need a crystal ball. Return the trees to their cradles, burn the land clean of history, seethe warning, blaze insurrection, do not slow, let them see the inferno they created. 2. Local residents now live in a way that is prepared for natural disaster. In the country my mother loves, in its naked heart, coastlines unravel into starving hands, drawing anything with mass into wet embrace. Include the slippers, whose tattered pockets kept our feet from catching wind, and the plastic collected to prove we exist. Include the caution tape, the bamboo, the dining tables, the books, the altars, the rice, the fields they grow in, the aoyai, the photos, and the children who have now found mothers in this soft earth. They say it sounds like a bomb. When the mountain that is not actually a mountain explodes, and it weeps burials for the willowed bodies who watch water rise to fool their conscience, who recite Buddha's name until synonymous with mosquito hum, who hold real hands in the dark of electricity while millions of hummingbirds crash into sheet metal roof and herds of baby elephants swarm at the ankles which, of course, The meteorologists will call rainfall, and the parents will call temporary, will call home 3. Their only desire was to be together in the home they loved. The structures are empty now, either because the people fled or endured baptism by flame flood. An elderly couple is found in the charcoal of their farm. A boy, recognized under comic shop sludge. The men on the news say climate change is a hoax. I talk back, hold the objects they inhabit, break them. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Huynh, and I'm the 2021 National Youth Poet Laureate. I am also a student, scientist, and resident of Sacramento, California. The poem I just performed for you is called It Does Not Matter Any Longer Where You Live, and I wrote it in October of 2020. During this time, California was in the midst of its wildfire season. The air was choked with smoke, imparting everything with an apocalyptic glow. I waited anxiously for updates from my friends whose homes were threatened by the burning, fast-moving and unpredictable. At the same time, residents in central Vietnam were witnessing the worst flood conditions in the region to date. Ancestral homes were being washed away, and with them, generations of history and people. I felt helpless as I watched newsreels depicting the mass destruction. California, where I've lived all my life, became rivered with fire. Vietnam, my parents' motherland, became a landscape of mud. My home, in both senses of the word, was disappearing. I knew I had to do something about it. After donating what I could, I turned to a place where I knew I could find inexhaustible power, my story and the stories of other people. Next slide, please. I began doing extensive research into the natural disasters in California and Vietnam. I took note of sensory details from interviews with flood victims. I looked at picture after picture of molten forests and their desolate aftermath. At the heart of it all, I wanted to understand the human impacts of these events. Who was hurt? Who was lost? What did they love? What did they dream of? And poetry gave me the framework to parallel these horrors in a way true to how they position themselves in my mind. Next slide, please. On a local level, I experienced the effects of the wildfires in California and waited with a half-hearted hope for their end. This became part 1 of my poem. They waited for the answers they didn't want to hear but knew were reality. On an international scale, I followed the flooding in Vietnam, knowing how my parents suffered a quiet devastation at the destruction of their homeland. This became part 2. Local residents now live in a way that is prepared for natural disaster. And part 3 of the poem arose as a reckoning of the degrees of survival granted to various actors in the climate crisis. Here I incorporated a sequence of images: an elderly couple burned alive, a boy smothered by a landslide, and the loudest survivors, politicians who insist that climate change is a myth. The irony of it does not escape me, that the people least impacted by the worsening environment are often the most visible in these conversations, and this includes myself. I'm incredibly privileged to be able to be here with you all today. I have no immediate dangers to my well-being that would otherwise force me to choose where I put my energy. It is a privilege to be able to reflect on my position in the climate crisis and use poetry as a way to imagine better worlds. Knowing this, I'm committed to uplifting marginalized narratives with my art. Next slide, please. Far too often, we publicize alarming data on global warming and fail to consider the human costs. Communities of color in particular are disproportionately affected by these injustices, and it's no accident. I want to use poetry to address the historical injustices that have ravaged our communities, to give them the quality of life they deserve. Environmental justice is not about meeting quotas or preserving national parks. It's about protecting the community's right to a dignified, healthy life. Next slide, please. Along with writing, I encourage you to ask yourselves, what can I do that my words can't? Outside of poetry, I conduct research at the UC Davis Environment, Land, and Food Systems Lab, where I examine geographic disparities in access to nutritious food. And a screenshot of one of my community reports is on the left side of the screen. Meanwhile, as a volunteer with the FarmLink project, I work to bring fresh produce to these same communities through grassroots volunteering and volunteering at my local food bank. My background in research and volunteering provides me with the context to frame these human stories in poetry, specifically surrounding climate change. And I know that all of you are engaged in your own incredible research projects, and I hope you'll be able to bring those skills into every space you enter. Next slide, please. Climate change is an issue we can solve in our lifetime, but to do so, we'll have to draw from across disciplines to find intersectional solutions. So keep learning from everyone and everything. Know that science and art can exist in harmony. Ask questions, fail forward, and remember your people. Only then will we create an environment that is meant for us all. Thank you.